and we were kind of hiding out in there, and then we heard shooting get closer from inside, so we ran back out, and that's when we hopped the fence. When we hopped the fence, my two roommates bolted. I was still a little staggering because it was a high fence for me to, jump over. During my run across the parking lot, I did hear some more shooting, and it kind of frightened me, so my first instinct was to jump behind a car and duck. During that process is when I just decided to crawl under the car, and I just waited it out. Once the shooting got further from what it sounded like, I, kind of gave a peek around and crawled out. That's when I noticed, I guess, another club goer. He was kind of staggering. I noticed he was covered in blood, and I kind of crept over to him and then was like, "Hey, I'm here to help you. What's going on?" We crept back, hid behind the car. He was like, "I think I got shot." And it did turn out he got shot once in one arm and once again in the other arm. My first instinct was, we got to stop the bleeding man and get you to the hospital or get you to the nearest police officer. And so I took my shirt off and then tied it around his first arm to stop the bleeding. And then I asked if I can have his shirt so I can tie it around his other arm. And then he went ahead to complain of a pain on his back, and it turned out he got shot again on his back. So I was like, we got to get you to a safe zone and then to the hospital to control this bleeding, et cetera. So we did that, and then we kind of dodged and weaved through the parking lot, got to the safe zone. The officer told us to stay down. Another standby person was just, kind of ducking over across the street. I was like, "Hey, I need another shirt because he has another open wound. I need to apply pressure." At that point, the officer was like, "We're going to escort you guys to the ER through a police car." He's like, he's like, "I want you to lay down, and then I want to throw him on top of you so that way I can kind of bear hug him and make sure everything's tightened so he doesn't bleed out as much." During the rush over to the ER, the police officers were just basically like, "Keep him conscious, keep talking to him." So that's how I got his name. I was like, "Hey, what's your name? You're going to be okay. I'm Josh." He was like, "I'm Rodney." I was like, "Where are you from? How old are you?" He's like, 27, Jacksonville, Florida. I was like, "Any siblings? Who do you live with?" He's like, "My brother." And I, told him I'm from Mississippi originally. I'm 26, et cetera. I told him everything's going to be okay. And that, we're almost to the ER. I told him, I was like, "I'm not sure if you're religious or not, but I want to say a prayer for you and make sure that you're okay." And then I'm not sure if his mumbling was a prayer or not, or if he was just delusional, but we got to the ER pretty quick. I helped them get him out of the car and onto a stretcher, and that was that. I waited around forever at the hospital. They wouldn't give me any information. I didn't even know his last name last night at all. It turns out that my Facebook post has gone viral, and it turns out one of his friends that he was with commented, and I reached out to them. I got his last name. It is Sumter, Sumter. And then they got in touch with his family, and they gave me an update that, yes, he was shot, and yes, he is stable. So that's as far as I know, is that he is fine. So I hope he stays fine and stays in a stable state, and that he comes out, quickly.
My gosh, Josh, you saved his life. You saved that man's life. Paint the picture for me in that police car. Were you were grasping him to stop the bleeding?
Yeah, it was kind of like we're both laying on the back of the police car. There's blood all over it. He basically, his arms are tied with two T-shirts, and then I'm bear hugging him to stop the bleeding with the other shirt on his back. And I'm just talking to him and, kind of rocking him a little bit to keep him conscious. And the more I talked to him, he was pretty responsive. He gave me his name. I didn't really get into detail because the hospital was maybe 5 minutes away, if that. So it was really brief, and we got there as quick as possible.
Josh, where do these instincts come from? I think a lot of people would have just run for their lives and tried to save themselves, but you stopped. You saw a man staggering with 3 gunshot wounds and decided to save his life last night.
I'm not really sure. Maybe it was just the adrenaline rush in the moment. Everyone has a fight or flight in them. I definitely did flight at first when I jumped the fence and ran for it, but during the process, I heard more gunshots, so I hid, and then I don't know if it was meant to be for me to be there and hide, but I do have a passion for medical. I am a nursing student. I do have some CPR training, so I kind of knew stopping the bleeding was the main goal, and so I definitely, kicked it into like high gear with the adrenaline rush going and everything. It didn't really faze me at the time until I saw him get rushed into the hospital. That's when I had my breakdown, and then I just kind of got it together after that.
What do you mean you had your breakdown? What happened?
I think the adrenaline rush wore off, and then I realized that there was a shooting and that I was covered in blood, and it was kind of scary. So I have a panic attack disorder, so I actually started having one, and they had to, sit me down and tell me breathe easy and take deep breaths. So, I eventually calmed down and whatnot. So it wasn't horrible. I didn't have a total freak out, but it was just kind of like a slap in the face, like, wow, this really just all happened.
God bless you, Josh. You saved his life last night. How are your friends doing? You said you were there with 2 roommates. Were they injured at all in the shooting?
Not at all. They actually hopped over, ran for it. They got into the safe ground. They actually thought something happened to me because I wasn't behind them any longer. That's because I was hiding. And once they got past the police perimeter, no one was allowed to go back into the war zone over there. So, but I did, once I got to the hospital and kind of cleaned the blood off, I called them and let them know that I helped someone and that I'm admitted into the hospital just because I did help rescue him and bring him to the hospital. They needed my witness statement, so I had to stay there and give written and verbal ones all until like 7 a.m. this morning.
We're about 10.5 hours after this shooting started at 2 o'clock in the morning in the club where you were when you made your dash for your life. Have you heard other stories from people inside, people who may have been injured, people who may have escaped?
One of the bartenders I know got shot in the leg. He's actually on footage with one of our news teams. Another one I heard was injured but not shot. As far as anything I've heard through social media, there were a few of the performers that were climbing through the air ventilation system to escape through the AC unit.
Wow.
I did hear that there was about at least 15 people barricaded in a bathroom with the door held shut. As far as anything else, I'm not really sure. It's all hearsay right now. But that's as far as I know on anything else.
But did I hear you right? You said some people inside the club climbed out through air ducts. Did they make it out?
Yes, they did make it out.
And when you heard the shooting begin, obviously your brain doesn't go there right away because, my God, how could it? You can't imagine you're being shot at in a nightclub when you're having a good time. What did it register as at first, and then when did you realize this was something much worse? At
first, it was like a bam, bam, bam. So we thought maybe there was some sound difficulties with the speakers. Maybe a speaker blew. Maybe someone was being a jokester and lit off a firecracker. I'm not sure. We did kind of do a little head duck because we didn't know what it was. And then it didn't register until we snuck outside just to kind of be in a safer zone when we heard more of the bam, bam, and then that's when we saw people running and jumping the fence and saying someone has a gun, there's a shooting, and that's when it kind of was like, oh, wow.
That was Joshua McGill, spoken to us a few minutes ago, eyewitness and hero during last night's shooting. As you heard very clearly, he saved a man's life. We're getting more and more stories like that out of the horror of last night, where 50 people were killed inside the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. Shooting began at 2 o'clock in the morning. A hostage situation went on until 5 o'clock this morning, when Orlando police sent in the SWAT team and killed Omar Mateen, the shooter. NBC News has now learned that the gunman, Mateen, dialed 911 and pledged his allegiance to al-Baghdadi of ISIS. Let's check in with Pete Williams. Pete, what more can you tell us?
We've heard from several law enforcement officials now that just before the shooting started at the club, that the Mateen, the man who's said to have fired the shots, dialed 911, got a local 911 operator, and swore allegiance to al-Baghdadi, who is the head of ISIS. Now, that obviously puts a slightly different look at this investigation. It certainly brings the whole question of Islamic terror radical influences back into the picture. What we're told also by law enforcement officials is that when they were initially looking at him, and we've been saying all morning that that his name was on a watch list or was in their database, or as the saying goes, at one point had been on their radar. The reason now we're told is that he came to their attention 3 or 4 years ago because of some statements he had made. He was sort of spouting off, expressing support for radical Islamic views, but that they looked at him and decided at the time that he was just a hothead and that there was no sign that he was planning any kind of attacks. And remember, that was 3 years ago. And the fact is, of course, these are First Amendment protected expressions. People say these sorts of things all the time, and the FBI can't keep everybody under surveillance who at any one time spouts off about violent extremism. So his wife also has, interestingly, Willie, given an interview to the Washington Post in which she says that her husband was a violent man, that their marriage 8 years ago was normal, that she met him online, moved to Florida and married him, but then he became abusive and beat her. We knew that he was divorced. They had a son apparently out of that marriage, but she says that he was a hothead, that he was sort of an unstable person. And this is consistent with the sort of picture we're getting from law enforcement, which is that he was prone to these sort of outbursts and statements. But what specifically led to this shooting at this time, they're still trying to look into. Although, as we've been reporting, his father says that it was seeing gay men kissing in Florida that set him off. But that would sort of fit in this picture that's beginning to emerge of him as somebody who was a violent, prone person.
Yeah, again, the reporting you have now, Pete Williams, for our audience is that Mateen called 911, pledged allegiance to al-Baghdadi or some celebration of al-Baghdadi, who is the head of ISIS. The other story Pete is sharing with us from the Washington Post, up right now, an interview with Mateen's ex-wife, where she claims that he beat her. So put these pieces together a little bit, Pete. As you say, this is kind of a nexus between a guy who probably had anti-gay views based on what his father said and a guy who was engaged in some pretty serious terrorism views as well.
Right. And I don't think they've fully formed a picture yet of the motive of what happened here. I think it's beginning to form. What precisely the role of Islamic or ISIS propaganda played in his thinking, we don't know. There obviously is a very strongly anti-gay component to ISIS propaganda, and whether that was merely fit into something he already believed or pushed him over the edge or what, we just don't know, and I don't think they know. But I think it's a little clearer picture now. As I say, they found no indication that this was a directed attack.
Pete, do you expect when the president speaks in just a few minutes we'll hear any more on the investigation, or will this probably be more of a claim of thoughts and prayers for families and victims in Orlando?
No, I'd be very surprised, based on the usual pattern, the way things goes, that he says anything at all about the investigation. You know, the FBI and the law enforcement down there still haven't formally given out his name, so I can't imagine the president will go there. He never does in these things. It'll be more of a kind of reflective statement about what's happened, well wishes for the families and so forth.
You mentioned, and you've been mentioning for several hours now, that Mateen was in a database for law enforcement, and that perhaps it was just because he was a peripheral player in something, or that he was spouting off, as you put it, radical views online. Generally speaking, Pete, at what point does law enforcement start to take spouting off more seriously?
Well, they always look at it. And, you know, if you look at some of these arrests of people for being associated with terror groups or material support to terrorism, sometimes that's the way they start, that you become aware that somebody has strong views in support of Islamic extremism, and then you start to say, well, you know, is this somebody we should be paying closer attention to? The FBI has to make these decisions dozens of times a day, or certainly dozens of times a week, and we know that there are hundreds and hundreds of people who are under surveillance. I've not gotten any indication that he ever rose to that level, that they looked at him initially and decided that he was just somebody who was basically all talk. Something along the way changed. What that was, whether it was just a matter of months ago or longer, is something that they're now trying to answer.
All right, Pete Williams, who's been all over this story. We'll let you get back to your reporting. Check back in shortly. We now have our first look at the gunman. This is the man who perpetrated the worst mass shooting in the history of the United States. 50 people dead. That is Omar Mateen, 29 years old, taking a selfie. We don't know exactly when that picture's from. He was from Port St. Lucie, Florida, a United States citizen. And this is actually a look now at his home where you can see law enforcement has descended. They'll be going through everything they can find in that home to try to determine a motive beyond what we've just heard, which is that he called 911, according to Pete Williams, 911, before the shooting began to alert police and to pledge his allegiance to the head of ISIS, al-Baghdadi. But again, that is Omar Mateen, our first look at him. Let's turn back to Sean Henry. Sean, since we spoke last, we've got this new information about the 911 call, this report from his ex-wife to the Washington Post in an interview saying that Mateen used to beat her, she claims. What does this add to the story for you?
Well, there's a lot coming out, Willie. As this investigation continues, you're hearing from witnesses that were there. We've heard about this 911 call, Pledge of Allegiance to al-Baghdadi, and now the wife or ex-wife who's providing some information about his violent behavior. I think what you may see here is this a conflagration or a confluence of information that comes together where he may be mentally unstable, as the ex-wife purports. He may have this allegiance to ISIS. He may have seen these two men kissing. We've seen reporting out of Europe and the Middle East that ISIS condemns homosexuality. It's against Sharia law, and that may be a component of this. Again, this is going to take days and weeks going forward to really put together a full picture of who this guy was, what his motivation was, what inspired him, how long has he been planning this, etc. So this is going to continue. But this newest information from the wife and then this 911 call certainly starts to change the complexion of this, Willie.
Let me ask you, Sean, as a guy who's been on the inside, the same question I just asked Pete Williams, a guy 3 or 4 years ago who was on law enforcement's radar because of some things he was saying online, some radical talk, but no radical action. At what point, as you keep an eye on those people, do they escalate to a level of surveillance, perhaps, or someone you should take very seriously?
That's a great question. I was listening to Pete's commentary, and he really, I think, did a good job explaining that. I've been involved in those meetings quite often where we are trying to make a determination of how many resources do we apply to a particular individual. It's a very, very challenging decision because, as Pete mentioned, there are hundreds of people who are on the FBI's radar. And somebody who might have made a statement off the cuff in front of coworkers, what level does that rise to? If somebody has taken some type of a violent action, if they're going out to obtain weapons or to obtain something that's going to help support some type of a violent act, that certainly rises to another level. But there is a very rigid process the FBI has in coordination with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. That's a very important piece here. I've heard some comments, you know, the FBI didn't pass information to the local law enforcement. Local law enforcement is on the JTTF. They're on that task force with the FBI. They're part of the investigations. So there certainly is that communication between federal, state, and local officials. But when people get together, you're evaluating how do you apply limited resources that the FBI has. It's very, very complex, very resource intensive to do some of these surveillance programs. That will focus and lean on where we have somebody we believe is violent, we believe they're going to take the next steps, we believe they might be involved with other co-conspirators, they're in the planning stage. The FBI is going to use all resources at their disposal to focus on that. But when you've got somebody who makes an off-the-hand comment, you've got to investigate it, but at some point you move on to another priority. It's just really the dynamic here and the volume of information intelligence that the FBI has collected, Willie.
You know, Sean, we in the media and also the public at large is so accustomed to getting information so fast and wanting more and more. You stop for a second here, you see that we're less than 12 hours since those first shots were fired, and already we know an awful lot about this guy. How quickly has this process been moving behind the scenes with the FBI, local, the sheriff's department as well there? They got to this guy pretty quickly and got his background out there.
They absolutely did, and I was glad to see this morning all law enforcement agencies working together. That's the way this is supposed to work. The Joint Terrorism Task Force, in my opinion, is one of the greatest tools for law enforcement because it really is state, local, federal agencies coming together with the intelligence community, even international coordination, really marshaling all of the resources of the community to focus on the most significant, highest priority threats. To see where they've gone thus far, behind the scenes, I can tell you all the resources in Orlando, in the field office, up in Tampa, Miami, I'm sure is providing some support, and then FBI headquarters in D.C. and the international community reaching out to others. This is absolutely a law enforcement team effort. Everybody's coming together, trying to identify what happened, who this was, what his motivation was, and again, as I mentioned earlier, looking forward, looking through the windshield, looking down the road to see, is there something else? Is there other chatter? Are there others involved? Or is there somebody who is not necessarily involved but is inspired because of what they saw? The FBI, JTTF is going to be focusing on that to disrupt any type of activity while continuing to build on this active investigation, Willie.
And also working backward to see what signs may have been there that this was coming. Sean Henry, thank you so much. We'll be back to you shortly. The big news, though, that Pete Williams just brought us, the shooter, Omar Mateen, in this Pulse nightclub shooting that claimed the lives of 50 people and injured 53 more, made a phone call moments before the shooting began around 2 o'clock Eastern time in Orlando, called 911, and pledged his allegiance to the head of ISIS, al-Baghdadi. We're expecting a statement from President Obama in less than 10 minutes. Peter Alexander is inside the White House briefing room. Peter, good morning.
Hey, Willie, good to see you right now. Unfortunately, under these circumstances, we are preparing to hear from the president now to make remarks for the 15th time in the course of his presidency after a mass shooting in this country. Orlando now joining the ranks of places like Tucson, of Aurora, of so many tragedies, including Newtown, where nearly 24 children were among those dead. On that day, President Obama said it was the worst day of his presidency, but now he's presiding over what is, in fact, the worst mass shooting in the United States history. We are told that the president has been briefed by his advisor on all issues, Homeland Security and counterterrorism. We saw with our own eyes that the head of the FBI, Director Comey, is inside the White House right now, here in the West Wing. We believe the two have been speaking about what's been going on right now. We don't know exactly what the president's going to say. We've been speaking to officials behind the scenes. Obviously, they are not making any specific comment about the details of the investigation right now, including what we heard from our own colleague Pete Williams a matter of minutes ago. But it's certain this president will express the frustration that he has throughout the course of his presidency over the inability of his administration to be able to change laws as they relate to gun violence. Now, as we learn about the intersection of gun violence and Islamic radicalism, Islamic terrorism, we certainly think the president will have to react to that as well. Willie?
And by all accounts, what we've heard from Pete Williams is the shooter, Omar Mateen, did have a legal firearms license. Peter Alexander will be watching along with you in just a few minutes when the president steps into that briefing room. Let's bring in first, though, New York Congressman Peter King, Republican, serving Long Island here in New York. Congressman, good to have you with us this morning. Is this an act of international terrorism based on what you've heard?
Well, it's certainly based on what Pete Williams has reported, and he's is always right. I would say this was at least inspired by international terrorism. I mean, all the evidence is there. So, again, we'll have to see whether or not he was just inspired, whether or not he was in direct contact with ISIS, whether or not they recruited him. But there's no doubt that he is part of that ISIS world. And that's what ISIS has done, which has really revolutionized much more than al-Qaeda. They're able to reach out to so many different types in society. You know, the psychotic people, those who are leaning toward ISIS, those who actively want to become ISIS members. By use of the internet, they've really appealed to a broad section of malcontents in society. We've had cases in New York where police officers have been attacked by hatchets, by people who were inspired by ISIS. These are mental cases. Same in Canada, we've seen this. So, again, one way or the other, I mean, everything right now is leaning toward ISIS, and I would certainly consider this an act of terrorism, yes.
That leads us to the difficult question of what to do about a lone person like this who perhaps didn't travel abroad, we don't know yet, but didn't travel abroad to receive any training, but just by virtue of having a laptop could be inspired to do something like this.
Yeah, again, it's very difficult, but we need all the intelligence we can get. Now, my understanding is that he was investigated 3 years ago by the FBI, and they couldn't find anything, and they stopped the investigation, which I can understand. But I would hope when that happened, the FBI gave that information to the local police, because the FBI doesn't have the capacity to be following up on a regular basis on what's going on in different communities. The local police can. And that was a mistake that was made in Boston, where the FBI did not tell the Boston police about the older Tsarnaev brother. They dropped the investigation of him. If the Boston detectives have been aware of that, they could well have been able to spot what Tsarnaev had become radicalized. So that could be one of the lessons we learned from this, that information, even if it doesn't pan out in the beginning, should be shared with local law enforcement.
What about the position, Congressman, the FBI is in, as just laid out by Sean Henry, former FBI, and also by Pete Williams, which is that you can have somebody talking trash, if you'll forgive the term, in a chat room somewhere or on Facebook or online, and not escalate it to the point of somebody who should perhaps be under surveillance and could eventually carry out an attack like this.
Yeah, listen, I think that obviously you can't arrest somebody for that, and probably 9 out of 10 cases it adds up to nothing. But I think the local police should be made aware of it, because if the local police know that and that person's name is there, then they may hear something else that by itself wouldn't mean anything. You put the two of them together, though, and it does come together. So that's why I believe that more information, again, so long as it's kept within the law enforcement community, is important and is vital.
And Congressman, before I let you go, we're going to go hear from the president in just a few minutes. Mr. Mateen was, in fact, a United States citizen born in the state of New York, we're told. Have you heard of any New York connection to Omar Mateen?
No, I haven't, and I've been talking to local police. I've not picked up any connections at all. But again, I can't emphasize enough, this is the early stage of this investigation. I mean, a lot of information has come out, but usually that means a lot more is going to come out as this investigation goes forward.
That's right. Congressman Peter King, thanks so much for taking some time with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
If you're just joining us, we are covering the worst mass shooting in the history of this country. 50 people are dead after a shooting that began at 2 o'clock in the morning, Orlando time, at Pulse Nightclub, a very popular gay club that was crowded. Police say it was more than 300 people. Shooting broke out. Omar Mateen, the shooter, a 29-year-old man from Port St. Lucie. This is our first image of him now, a selfie he'd taken of himself and posted online. Walked in with an AR-15 style assault rifle and also with a handgun and started shooting, but not before he called 911 and pledged allegiance to the head of ISIS, al-Baghdadi. 53 more people injured in that shooting, some of them critically. Authorities have warned us that the death toll could rise because of that. It went on until 5 o'clock in the morning. So from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m., a hostage standoff inside the club, people being held by Mateen. The decision was made by local police and the FBI to send in the SWAT unit. SWAT went in. Mateen was killed at that time. We've heard harrowing first-person eyewitness accounts from inside, including one man who saved a life, another man who saved 2 lives, who just told us on the telephone by, in many cases, applying pressure to gunshot wounds, people falling into each other's arms, asking for help. One man we spoke to on the phone said a woman came to him, shot, and said, "Please call my mother." He put on his phone, and the 3 of them talked through it together. He believes she was stabilized and survived. These are the stories we're hearing. We're hearing performers inside the club climbing through air conditioning ducts to safety to save their own lives. Scenes of chaos, loud music, darkness, and then gunfire. We're going to hear from the President of the United States on this in just a moment. So let's go to Peter Alexander. He is in the White House briefing room. Peter?
Hey, Willie, when we heard from the president last October after the shootings at a community college in Oregon, He was visibly frustrated about what he said had become the routine nature of these mass shootings in the country. We have seen all sorts of emotions from this president in what will now be the 15th time he's addressing a national audience following a mass shooting here on domestic soil. He's been emotional at times. We've seen him in tears. We have seen him angry. At that time in October, he said this is an issue that needs to be politicized. He said it simply was not enough for us to be sending the best wishes and our prayers to the families of victims. He said simply that was not enough. We do expect the president will be walking out here a short time from now. For the moment, the flag remains at full staff outside the White House, but generally by tradition, the flag will be lowered after a formal proclamation from the White House. That has not yet occurred. The president coming out today on what is in effect a summer sunny day here in Washington, D.C., a day where most Americans were expecting to start their holiday vacations with their families. Instead, this president, who just celebrated the graduation of his daughter a couple of days ago, will be speaking about the loss of 50 lives, many of them many young people at that nightclub in Orlando. Willie?
When we started our coverage early this morning, the estimate, Peter, from police was that approximately 20 people had died. Then a couple of hours ago, we got word that the number had jumped to 50. As you say, the president has seen too much of this. Aurora, Tucson, Sandy Hook, just to name a few over the course of his presidency. He likely won't comment on any investigation at this point. It's just too soon for him to say anything. Have you heard anything from White House officials about what he might say in just a minute or so?
Yeah, right now, we really haven't. They said they're going to let the president's remarks speak for themselves when he comes out here just moments from now. Obviously, we know that he continues to be updated over the course of this day here in the West Wing in the Oval Office. He was initially advised by his advisor on Homeland Security and counterterrorism, a woman by the name of Lisa Monaco. When we were here earlier this morning, we saw the FBI Director James Comey, who was here as well, speaking face-to-face with the president, obviously, on the course of the investigation taking place right now. The president did say, and we were communicated this through a statement sent out earlier today, that he would direct all federal resources to Orlando to help in this investigation in any way possible. I suspect he will communicate that thought as well. But many people obviously will be focused on two key elements of this situation: the availability of guns in this country, though we are told that these guns were purchased legally, and also the intersection with Islamic radicalism. This has obviously been a heavily politicized issue, but as Pete Williams just said, given the information we're now learning from federal law enforcement officials about a phone call by this shooter to 911 in Orlando just moments before that shooting took place, in effect pledging allegiance to the head of ISIS, it's certainly an issue that's going to be hard for this president to avoid on this day as well. Willie?
All right, Peter, that door behind you should open any minute. We'll let you take your seat. In the meantime, let's go back to Pete Williams. Pete, a lot of people may just be tuning in to hear from the president. Why don't we recap briefly who we know Omar Mateen is and what we've learned about his life?
Right. He's 29 years old, born in New York, lived in Florida for at least the last 10 years, was working as a security guard, had a license for security guards to carry weapons, which means that he was familiar with weapons. Authorities say he came to that nightclub in Orlando with a AR-15 style, what some people call assault weapon, and a handgun, and opened fire. 50 people have been killed, at least 50 people, 3 more people wounded. And authorities say that he had been looked at by the FBI about 3 or 4 years ago because of some statements he made. As one official said, he was spouting off about ISIS, about Islamic radicalism, perhaps not ISIS itself, because it wasn't very much in the news then. I should say, while I'm talking, we're looking at pictures from Florida of the authorities preparing to conduct a search. They've gotten, you see the Port St. Lucie police car. That's where the last known address we knew of for Omar Mateen. And so authorities are either now conducting or preparing to conduct a search. They have to get a search warrant before they can do that. But they say that he was familiar with weapons. They say that his father has told us that a couple of months ago, Mateen was with his own son and his father and saw men kissing in Miami, and that it just seemed to set him around over the bend. And his former wife, his ex-wife, we know that Mateen is divorced, has told the Washington Post that her husband was a violent man and beat her, that she thought he was mentally unstable and got divorced. And then we heard a short time ago from several officials that just before the shooting overnight, Mateen dialed 911 and pledged allegiance to al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS. So that's the picture that's emerging of somebody who was apparently a very much of an unstable person, very familiar with weapons.
Pete, it's one thing to call 911 and pledge your allegiance to ISIS. It's another thing altogether to actually be connected to ISIS. Is there any evidence from law enforcement that Mateen was connected in any way to ISIS?
Well, connected to ISIS, of course, these days is a very flexible term because anybody can swear allegiance to ISIS. Whether he was actually in contact with ISIS officials overseas, the assessment I'd gotten a couple of hours ago was that the answer to that was no. So this, there's sort of two models that the authorities look at in terms of ISIS. One is people sent here by ISIS to carry out attacks, sort of along the old al-Qaeda model, or people who were already in the U.S. And bear in mind, Mateen was an American citizen born in New York, or people here radicalized and inspired to act by ISIS. Now, we don't even know if it's the latter. We just know that he consumed and was interested in ISIS propaganda and found radical Islam to be to his liking and was spouting off about it as many as 3 or 4 years ago, and how that all pieces together to lead to what happened at that place in Orlando at yesterday or, very early this morning. Why then? Why there? Those are questions that they don't have any answers to.
We don't know if there's a connection or just inspiration, but as you know well, Pete Williams, it's one of the great frustrations of law enforcement these days that you can have a lone wolf who's inspired by something he read online, something he saw on TV, and act on behalf of a group he's never met or spoken to.
Right, and why Orlando? He lived about an hour and 45 minutes away in Port St. Lucie. Had he heard about this place? Was he planning to attack it for weeks and months? Did it have something to do with the period we're now in, the Islamic holy days of Ramadan? Did it have something to do with the fact that we're coming up on gay pride events all around America? Were these coincidences? Did they factor in? Those answers are going to have to come from a very careful reading of his social media, his emails, his contacts with other people, messages, text messages, phone calls, and that we don't know the answer to yet.
And worth underlying something you've been saying all morning, Pete, which is that if he is in fact inspired by or associated by ISIS, that is a group that's very strongly against homosexuality, strongly against gays, condemns it. So it would add up that he would walk into the Pulse nightclub, a very popular gay club in Orlando. Pete, thank you so much. Pope Francis has now reacted to this shooting in Orlando. He expresses deep horror and condemnation of homicidal folly in the Florida mass shooting. That is from Pope Francis. Let's bring in Chuck Todd now. Chuck, we're going to hear from President Obama in 2 or 3 minutes here. You've covered an awful lot of these shootings around the president. What do you expect his tone to be, and what does he view as his role in these moments?
Well, I think that he views his role as more than just the consoler-in-chief on this, I think now. Peter, I thought, summed it up very well. This is a man who believes we can't seem to, we always want to have separate conversations, a separate terrorism conversation, a separate gun conversation, separate, in this case, it's a hate crime conversation as well. And I suspect he is going to try to say, don't just grab onto what's most politically convenient for you as a citizen or as a lawmaker. This is, I think, look, I think it's very tough for any of these elected officials because we've got a lone wolf situation. There's this feeling of powerlessness. And I think sometimes we in the media do this to our elected officials. We're demanding a response and demanding answers, and they're struggling with this. This lone wolf ISIS inspiration thing is something that they talk about it all the time, and there's no magic elixir for this. And I think it's hard to give that answer to the public. It's not a satisfactory answer, and that's why you see sometimes an attempt by lawmakers to say something almost over the top because so many of their constituents may be demanding and aren't satisfied with what they're hearing and the frustration. And so you see, almost over the top language and responses. So I suspect that the president is going to try to force the idea of, like, don't just cling to one of these explanations. The fact of the matter is they may all be interconnected. An ISIS-inspired hate crime that has to do that also with the realization that this person was able to arm himself very easily. The idea that everybody wants to separate this out, I think it's impossible to do.
He's obviously made gun control part of his legacy. He'd like it to be that anyway. Do you think he begins that conversation this soon after the shooting?
He's done it before. Peter brought up Oregon, and that was, I remember that was it was a different tone the president took. It was an exasperated tone that he had there. So you know, look, I think I certainly think he is not afraid to have that conversation now. He's willing to take whatever criticism may come if he does, because I think he believes passionately that this has not been enough of a focus, that he believes this, no matter this may be a terrorism incident, an Islamic-inspired incident, ISIS-inspired, and he still believes we've got to deal with the issue of why can he get a weapon of war like an AR-15 so easily, and why is this so mainstream? He believes passionately in that, so I think he will not separate the two.
And these are problems, obviously, that will be inherited by the next president, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. We've been following their reactions all morning. Secretary Clinton put out a tweet. Donald Trump now, his third tweet on the incident, started off by his standard, relatively subdued. Really bad shooting in Orlando. Police investigating possible terrorism. Many people dead and wounded. That was about 5 hours ago. His most recent tweet, though, less than an hour ago, Chuck, appreciate the congrats for being right on radical Islamic terrorism. I don't want congrats. I want toughness and vigilance. We must be smart.
I have to say I was sort of taken aback when I read the phrase "appreciated the congrats." I don't know what that's about. I don't see how that's a something you acknowledge at a moment like this. Look, I do think that anybody running for office right now or an elected official, I said it before, number one, I feel like too many elected officials early on were stoking passions here too much, and elected officials have a responsibility not to do that. But the second thing here is this is a moment where we find out about a future president. How do they handle a crisis? How do they respond in a moment like this? And for many voters, I think we're getting a real-time idea of how Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, how the two of them handle a situation like this. I have to say, like I said, I'm very surprised by some of the language on that last tweet that Donald Trump used, and by the fact that he continues to tweet, to be honest, during this situation.
In its full context, too, I should point out, he sent out a tweet just before that said, horrific incident in Florida, praying for all the victims and their families. When will this stop? When will we get tough, smart, and vigilant? As we talk, Chuck, about this larger conversation about terrorism, larger conversation about guns, conversation about who's going to be the president of the United States, we shouldn't forget the 50 people who lost their lives and their families, and the people who were on the inside, many of them heroes that we've been talking to all morning and all afternoon already. Here's an interview from earlier today, Gabe Gutierrez down in Orlando speaking to a survivor of the shooting.
Tell me what happened. The music was going. It was just like any other good time. Everybody was doing their thing, dancing, drinking, and then you hear just bang, 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 and it's continuous. So at first we thought it sounded like the music, and then after that, I looked over and I saw bodies falling, people screaming. Person next to me was shot, the blood splattered, and then I fell down. It crawled out. I was crawling and people stomped on me, and then the fence fell over because there was a privacy fence back there. They took all that, and when I was running, I was crouched down and I was zigzagging just in case, because you can still hear the bullets going off. So you have no idea if they were outside, inside, because they started out inside, but the guns, you could still sound. It still sounded like it was in my head when I was outside.
How terrified were you at that point?
I was terrified. I was in shock, I think. I kind of like looked around me and realized, seeing people screaming in the blood and people laying on the ground, and it was just, the cops were just starting to get there. There was a couple that were already there, so it was nice to see how quick and responsive people were, because by the time the shots were going off and I had gotten out, there was already officers there. So everybody was, there was so many people responding. The whole community did.
When the first gunshots rang out, you thought it was part of the music.
Yeah, I thought it was, and I was just dancing, and I had taken my first sip of my drink, and it was intense at first. I was like, all right, new song or something. Bass, you can feel the bass of it, because it sounded so real. It was just like right there. And
you moved to Orlando just a short time ago, a couple months ago? Did you get a chance to see the shooter at all?
No, I didn't. Okay. No, it happened in the same area though. In the dance area. In the same area. Did you? You said you saw one of the people who were hit. You took off your bandana and rendered aid. Have you ever seen that much blood before? No, his whole pant leg was drenched in blood, and it was completely wet. And all I could do was like, oh my God. And then I wasn't sure if that was his only bullet wound. So when we were pressuring down, me and this other gentleman, we were checking the rest of his body to make sure he wasn't hit anywhere else. And we got his name as Junior, and so I was holding his hand and like telling him it's gonna be okay, talk to us, but he didn't know English. But I was like still trying to just be like, you'll get through this, you'll be okay, it's all right. And then paramedics showed up, and that's when they took over. We helped him on the stretcher.
That's Christopher HANSEN talking to our Gabe Gutierrez. We've had the privilege of talking to some of the heroes who were inside that club, Pulse nightclub in Orlando, about 2 o'clock this morning when the shooting broke out. Some of them telling us that people approached them with multiple gunshot wounds falling into their arms. One named Joshua McGill helped put pressure on in the back of a police car on a gunshot wound, got the person to the hospital, and saved that person's life. We're going to hear more and more stories like that, I suspect, over the course of the next few days. Some breaking news out of Los Angeles, interesting in the context of all this. The LA Times is reporting a man was arrested with assault rifles, ammunition, and possible explosives. The suspect said he was headed to the Los Angeles Gay Pride Parade. Let's listen into a press conference in Los Angeles. Okay, clearly we don't have the audio up yet, but again, just to recap the Los Angeles Times reporting here, and we're hearing more about this now from the Los Angeles Police Department. A man was arrested with explosives and firearms in his vehicle, telling police he was on his way to Gay Pride Parade. Let's go to that press conference.
And supplement the regular patrols that we have out there for the entire community. So please know that we are here to support. To my friends, as the liaison for the LGBTQ community, for the Chief of Police, let's have a beautiful day. Let's celebrate. As Mayor Garcetti said, we will have mourning in our hearts, but let us march forward today together, more unified than ever. Thank you very much.
So, thank you everyone for coming out this morning. A special thanks to everyone who's dedicated to keeping us safe. Inside of our festival, we have heightened security and airport-style metal detection. I want everyone to come out today.
Okay, obviously we just caught the tail end of that press conference. We'll re-rack it for you and get you all the pertinent information in there. But the LA Times is reporting that a man was arrested with explosives and weapons in his vehicle, stopped by police. He told them he was headed to the LA Gay Pride Parade. We also have new reporting from Pete Williams that the shooter in all this, Omar Mateen, called 911 just moments before the shooting broke out at 2 o'clock this morning Eastern Time at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, calling 911 and pledging his allegiance to the head of ISIS, al-Baghdadi. This is a man, Pete Williams reports, that about 3 years ago was known to law enforcement officials for spouting radical views, making some statements online, but never rose to the occasion, or the level, I should say, of surveillance. Someone who slipped through. This, again, is a 29-year-old man, a United States citizen, who drove from his home in Port St. Lucie, Florida, to Orlando, a little bit less than a 2-hour drive, probably last night. We know he was radicalized in some way. That's obviously clear now. There's a report in the Washington Post. His wife gave an interview there, said that Omar Mateen, her ex-husband, used to beat her. NBC News also spoke to Mateen's father, his father saying that he was shocked by this news, that he does not believe it was religious in nature. That's his opinion on that. But he did believe that perhaps it was a gay couple that he'd seen kissing in Miami a couple of months ago when he was there with his family that set him off in some way. And then he approached last night at 2 o'clock in the morning the Pulse nightclub, a very popular gay club in Orlando, and wreaked havoc, carrying out the largest mass shooting in the history of this country. 50 people are dead, 53 more are in hospitals right now, many of them critical. We're awaiting word from the President of the United States. He's set to give a briefing at the White House. Let's check back in with Peter Alexander. Hey, Peter.
Hey, Willie, it bears repeating. We've said this. This will be the 15th time that President Obama is speaking before the nation following a mass shooting in this country. Unclear exactly what the president will say here. We have seen a range of emotions in his past comments on gun violence. We have seen him in tears. We have seen him angry. We have seen him exasperated, frustrated by the routine nature with which he has to come before the country and speak in situations like this. Unclear exactly what we'll say here, but I think it's fair to capture a sense within many in the administration that there is a belief that radical Islamic ideology may be something that can influence the mind of a shooter, but the accessibility of weapons is what allows shooters to be able to commit horrific acts of violence like this. In the eyes of many here, those two things are not mutually exclusive. I suspect this president will keep a very somber tone as many people are looking to him on this day, recognizing that what he had said in the past was the worst day of his time in office was the shooting in Newtown, where there were more than 20 children killed. A total of 27 died on that day. This day, the death toll almost twice as large taking place at that club in Orlando. We expect the president will be out here a short time from now. For the moment, the flag remains at full staff outside the White House. I'd anticipate they will release a proclamation in the not-too-distant future after his remarks, and at that time would most likely be the time at which they would lower that flag to half staff. Willie?
Peter, we'll check back in with you shortly as the president makes his way to that briefing room. Another detail to sprinkle in here now. NBC News can report this. A senior Massachusetts law enforcement source says Omar Mateen, the shooter in Orlando, referenced the Tsarnaev brothers during his rampage. Local, state, and federal agencies in New England aware of the reference, continuing to monitor the events in Orlando, they say. The Tsarnaev brothers, of course, were responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. Pete Williams is back with us. Pete, what more can you tell us about this angle?
Well, a couple of things is looking at his history of rhetoric and trying to find out a little more about. We know that he made this phone call. We're trying to figure out if there was more that he said in this phone call other than just expressing support for the leader of ISIS, and also whether he made statements at the scene, whether he said something in support of ISIS or perhaps people in the U.S. who were inspired to carry out attacks. We're trying to sort through that now. One thing that we were looking back on, I was just in touch with people who regularly monitor ISIS propaganda to ask them what sort of anti-gay rhetoric ISIS has put out in the past. And what he says is that ISIS has regularly talked about homosexuality, that they're violently anti-gay, that they have videos that show the execution of people who are described as being gay. Some of them in the videos are seen being thrown off a roof of a building and then stoned. But ISIS believes that homosexuality is a violation of Sharia or strict Islamic law, and that the punishment is death. So there is if he was a consumer of ISIS propaganda, as it would appear he would have come across this. But again, the FBI had said as early as 2013 or 2014 he showed some interest in Islamic radicalism. That would have predated the relentless social media propaganda flow into the U.S. from ISIS. But certainly, if you were looking for that sort of thing, you could certainly find it on the internet.
Pete, I'm looking at this report as well. I don't know how much you've read in on this from the LA Times. Authorities in Santa Monica finding explosive as well as assault rifles and ammunition in the car of a man who told them he was in town for the LA Pride Festival in West Hollywood. Is there anything else you can tell us on this?
No, I'm aware of this. I've not done any reporting on it myself.
Okay. So Omar Mateen, as we know now, 29 years old, U.S. citizen, a man that's been on the radar, Pete, you've pointed out, for about 3 years for making radical statements online, but never escalated to the point where he was put under surveillance. What are the next questions here for law enforcement? What are they looking at in the coming hours?
I should say, just after you asked that question, just doing a little quick checking here, and I see that the mayor, Gil Garcetti, out in Los Angeles, has said that he thinks that arrest out there is completely unrelated to what happened in Orlando. Around the country, there are lots of gay pride activities planned for this time of year. This is Pride Month or Pride Week or something, and I think that there were parades planned. So there were lots of gay events, and those things would be in the news. So that may be the only thing that they have in common is just the timing, but no indication that the person there arrested had any connection to the person in Orlando. And having said all that, Willie, I apologize now. I've forgotten your question.
No, that's okay, Pete. I'm going to let you go report for a minute, and we'll jump back to you. Jim Cavanaugh is with us as well. Jim, I'll put the question to you. We've got all these pieces to the puzzle now that we're trying to put together about Omar Mateen here. We know he's 29 years old, a U.S. citizen. We know that he called 911 in the moments before he began shooting at 2 o'clock Eastern time and pledged his allegiance to ISIS. We know what his father has said about his views on gay people. We know what his ex-wife has said about the way he treated her. As you look at all these pieces, what do you see now, Jim, about 12 hours since the shooting began?
Yeah, I think you see a very clear picture of a guy who, through direct evidence, through his own words from his own mouth, before he committed the worst mass shooting murder in American history, the fact that he was inspired and acting for ISIS. It doesn't mean he's a member of ISIS, he's a U.S. citizen, but it clearly means in his mind he's pledging allegiance to the leader of ISIS, Willie. This is a fact that no one's going to change. He called 911 and he said it. There's prior information from the FBI, terrorist task forces, that they'd come across him in some vein. And also, it's not going to matter if he went to ISIS websites 5 times, 10 times, 25 times, 50 times. If these websites, spouting the hate and hatred against gay community, he went there, it somehow had an effect on him, inspired him somehow. He said so, and then he went operational, and he did so. So that is a guy who is an internationally inspired terrorist. He's also acting on hate. So hate is a very important part of the motive as well. And his father's comment to NBC reporter, and plus Pete uncovering the 9/11 call, these two are seminal facts in what's in the guy's mind. The commanders know this. The guy said this about the gay men he saw, and he was offended in his bigotry. He was offended for his son, and it seethed in him, and maybe he went back to the websites, in the 2 months since. But nevertheless, hate is a motive. Internationally inspired terrorism is a motive. And as you discussed, Willie, the Washington Post reporting that his wife said he beat her frequently. Well, he shouldn't even have been allowed to have a gun. If he'd been arrested for domestic assault, he wouldn't have been able to buy a gun in a gun shop, but apparently it was never reported. Maybe she was too afraid of him, and he wasn't arrested for it. So he was able to buy a gun, and easy to get the ammo, easy to get the gun, and act on his hatred and his inspiration from ISIS.
Yeah, Jim, we're under 2 minutes to the president, so forgive me if I cut you off in the middle of this next answer, but it's an important question, and one I understand fully has no easy answer. But what do you do about the kind of people you just described, who may have no direct link or connection to overseas operations or even anyone inside ISIS, but have a laptop or an iPhone, and they can easily be inspired to do something like Mateen did last night in Orlando?
Well, you got to listen to what the FBI director says. The Justice Department said, give them tools. Don't take away our liberties, but you got to give them basic tools, because they use those tools to interrupt many, many plots. And they can give you lists. We have lists in NBC, I'm sure, of all these plots that have been interrupted. But every plot can't be interrupted, because when it's in one guy's mind that's inspired, sometimes we don't know about them until they start pulling the trigger. So you just got to keep working, and trying to get as many as you can, and fight that ideology on the web, which the United States government, the State Department is doing a much better job than they were, a year ago, a year and a half ago.
All right, Jim Cavanaugh, we appreciate your perspective. We'll be back to you shortly. We should mention, for those of you turning in now and looking for F1 racing, it's being broadcast on the NBC Sports Network. We here are awaiting the President of the United States as he's about to step into the briefing room to make a statement on a terrible, terrible night in Orlando and in this country as 50 people were killed inside the Pulse nightclub. Let's go back to Peter Alexander there in the briefing room. Peter?
Willie, the president will be walking in momentarily. We just got the 2-minute warning a short time ago. We expect him to show the same types of frustration he's shown over the course of his presidency. This, again, the 15th time he will speak following a mass shooting here in the United States. The president saying these have become all too routine, saying that thoughts and prayers are no longer enough. Here comes the president.
Today, as Americans, we grieve the brutal murder, a horrific massacre of dozens of innocent people. We pray for their families who are grasping for answers with broken hearts. We stand with the people of Orlando who have endured a terrible attack on their city. Although it's still early in the investigation, we know enough to say that this was an act of terror and an act of hate. And as Americans, we are united in grief, in outrage, and in resolve to defend our people. I just finished a meeting with FBI Director Comey and my Homeland Security and National Security advisors. The FBI is on the scene and leading the investigation in partnership with local law enforcement. I've directed that the full resources of the federal government be made available for this investigation. We are still learning all the facts. This is an open investigation. We've reached no definitive judgment on the precise motivations of the killer. The FBI is appropriately investigating this as an act of terrorism, and I've directed that we must spare no effort to determine what, if any, inspiration or association this killer may have had with terrorist groups. What is clear is that he was a person filled with hatred. Over the coming days, we will uncover why and how this happened, and we will go wherever the facts lead us. This morning I spoke with my good friend Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer, and